So one of the nice things I have is that I work in a university. So I don't have to worry about tomorrow, I don't have to worry about next week, I don't have to worry about next year. I'm allowed to look a little bit further ahead. So what I'm talking about today is the 10 to 20 year time horizon. Carbon emissions in Australia and around the world have to reduce. That's a given. You can argue about the right timeframes, but it's very hard to see that by 2050, Australia doesn't have to be at a zero net emissions. Okay? One of the nice things is at the moment, renewable electricity is the easy way to get there. Okay? The technology is there and the economics are starting to be there so that we can start to hit the sort of emission trajectory that we need to hit the 2 degree targets. Okay? So what our group, the Renewable Energy Group at the ANU, is interested in then is how do we use that electricity to enable other reductions? And so what I'm going to do is try and take you on through a bit of a journey around how we might see that happening for the Pilbara. So you've already seen this slide a number of times today. Okay? The Pilbara is largely powered by gas. Okay? On an Australian level, that's pretty good. Emissions are probably half that you'd be seeing over on the east coast where it's all generated from coal. Okay? But even if we're talking sort of 50% reductions by 2030, okay, the gas here starts to become important and we need to start to look at alternatives. The reality is, though, that these alternatives are not a long way away. Okay. So one thing that most people probably didn't realise was that last year was a huge tipping point in terms of electricity production around the world. PV and wind, there was more power capacity installed last year than coal and gas. Okay, and that was for the first time. Okay, so there's all this talk about we need coal, we need gas to be able to power the future. Okay, this is changing. Okay, we're now at the point where there's more PV and more wind going in around the world than there is fossil fuels. Much more than hydro, much more than biomass, much more than nuclear. Okay, it is the dominant technology going in. And why is that happening? Okay, so this curve is really what it's all about. This is how solar prices have gone down as we've put in more and more solar. So on the vertical axis, what we're looking at is the price in US dollars, and across the right, we're going how much of it have we put in. Okay. So since 1970 to today, solar has got 200 times cheaper. 200 times. Other than those mobile phones in your pockets, I think you'd struggle to think of anything that's come down that far. Okay. And it hasn't stopped. Okay. You look at the last, 8 years, okay, there's still been a 10-fold decrease in PV prices. And it's actually got faster, not slower, in terms of the price reductions. Okay? So we're getting to the point where these technologies are not just there because we're thinking they're environmentally good, they're actually getting to the point where they're directly economically competitive. Okay? It's great that they're also environmentally good, but that's now becoming secondary. So why the Pilbara? So this is a map of sunshine. How much sunshine lands on the Earth in a given year. Okay? And what you see very nicely there is the Pilbara is in the hotspot. Okay? The best solar resource in Australia. Okay? So you compare it to down on around Canberra and Sydney and that, you've got 50% more sunshine. Even the good resource in North Queensland, you're probably 20% better. Okay? This is the best place to put PV in Australia. Okay? What's less obvious is it's not just the best in Australia. Okay? Pretty much it's the best in the world. Okay? There's a couple of pink spots on there, so a little bit in Chile. If you want to be up in the high Andes where there's never any rain, if you want to be in the Sahara, it's a little bit better. But after that, it's the Pilbara. Okay? So the Pilbara has a huge advantage in terms of the potential resource that's available. Okay? So if you're going to have an industry which is really dependent on renewable energy, then the Pilbara is the place to put it. Okay. So solar's, you can't do a lot with solar, can you? Okay, it's low efficiency, it's pretty low energy density. Little blue dot up there in the Pilbara, okay? That supplies all of Australia's energy needs. Okay? All of the electricity, 240 terawatt hours all of the East Coast, all of Perth, all of the Pilbara, that little blue dot. Okay, about 30 kilometres by 30 kilometres. Okay, I think we've probably got enough space in the Pilbara to slot that in. Okay, so this is the sort of game changer that's starting to occur around renewable energy. Is that solar is starting to get down to the price where it's competitive, and there's going to be an increasing push around the world to reduce carbon emissions. And the Pilbara is the place that can really take advantage of that. Look, the wind story is not as good. Okay? One of the differences with solar is that the further north you get, the closer to the equator, generally the sunshine gets better. Okay? Wind, less so. So if you have a look across the top of Australia, mostly the wind isn't all that great. Okay? But you do see some pockets in there. Okay? Again, when you get up nice and high, so the plateaus in the Pilbara, what you're seeing there is there's actually quite a good strong wind resource. And the two play together really quite nicely, because quite often there's an anti-correlation between sunshine and wind. Quite often the wind is in that early evening, first thing in the morning time period when the solar's not kicking in as much. So being able to use both of those resources can be quite powerful. Okay? But obviously, if you look a little bit further south, there's a spot that we're all at the moment, around the Perth region, which is pretty solidly red. Okay? And that's pointing to there's a very, very good wind resource, and that's why you're seeing quite significant amounts of wind going in the Swiss, down in this region. But we'll come back to that a little bit later. So, what's the next challenge? What do we do when the sun doesn't shine? What do we do when the wind doesn't blow? So we need storage. Okay? We need to be able to shift energy from times when we've got an excess of energy to a time when we've got a shortage of energy. So Horizon had a chat to us before. If I was a household level, batteries are the no-brainer. Okay? Batteries are really good if I want energy for a couple of hours and I want reasonably good power draw. I can easily get a few kilowatts out of a battery system for a home. Okay? But batteries probably aren't the solution when we're talking bulk energy storage. If I want to store gigawatt hours and terawatt hours of energy, then I need something else. And the solution there is pumped hydro. Okay? So pumped hydro is a very established technology. Okay? It's been used all around the world. Okay? There's more than 200 gigawatts, 5 times Australia's peak energy demand of pumped hydro installed around the world. Ironically, it was developed for the nuclear industry. Nuclear power plants just love to chug along at flat out. They don't like having to ramp up and down. Controlling those nuclear reactions up and down is really tough. When they had an excess of energy, they pumped water up the hill. And then when there was a shortage during the day, they let the water back down again. Okay? So we're just stealing the same technology the fossil fuel industry and the nuclear industry developed and transferring it across to renewables. The thing here is that we're not talking about damming rivers. Okay? What we're looking for is a high place next to a low place. Okay? And what we're doing is wanting to cycle water, pump water up the hill when we've got an excess of energy and let it come back down when we've got a shortage. Okay? So systems like we're seeing up the top right, where we've simply got a pump and a turbine. When we've got an excess, we pump the water up the hill, and when we've got a shortage, we let it flow down the hill. Okay? And so some of the work we've been doing is going around mapping where are all these sites around Australia. Okay? So even the Pilbara, relatively flat, not particularly hilly, doesn't stand out really well there. All those blue, yellow and red dots are places where there's enough height difference to potentially put in a pumped hydro system. A couple of 100 metres, you put an oversized farm dam at the bottom of the hill, an oversized farm dam at the top of the hill, and you cycle the water between the two, hundreds of times a year. Okay? Evaporation, the water is going to be precious. Okay? You're not going to let these systems sit out in the sunshine and have that water evaporate away. There's going to be evaporation suppressants, there's going to be liners to stop it from running away. Basically, it's just going to be a great big battery storing potential energy. Okay? The challenge there is that it's hard to manage small systems. So Horizon talking about trying to manage the NWIS and all the spinning reserves and whatever else that you have in there is challenging. The smaller the system you have, the more the weather that you have locally affects what happens. Okay? If we can spread out, then things get a lot simpler. So how do we spread out? So spreading out is all around this technology, high voltage DC. Okay? DC instead of AC, because you can carry about 3 times as much power for the same voltage. Okay? But we're talking very large voltage systems here. Okay? 240 volts in the mains at home, 11 kV in the distributor. Okay? We're talking 1.1 million volts, Very, very high voltages, very customised systems. But, again, very established technology. So Basslink, connecting Tasmania across to the mainland, that was a high voltage DC system, carrying about 400 megawatts of power from Tasmania to the mainland or vice versa. Okay. But these systems now are getting really, really big. Okay. China, this year, is installing a system that goes 3,000 kilometres, okay, 1.1 million volts, 12 gigawatts of power. Okay. So NWIS, about 2 gigawatts, Perth about 3 gigawatts peak. Okay. We're talking huge amounts of power being shifted around by these systems. Okay. So why does that get interesting? Okay. Now we start talking about sharing power, and we start talking about sharing risk and hopefully decreasing costs. Where would you look first? Okay. First thing we'd look at is connecting the NWIS to the Swiss. Okay. NWIS, we had great solar resources. The Swiss, we had great wind resources. Those two working together means we need much less storage than if we had those two systems independently. Okay. Then we start looking east. Okay. Do we start connecting that system into the NEM, the National Electricity Market for the East Coast? Okay. That system there can operate at relatively modest cost at 100% renewables, simply by having a good high voltage DC interconnection within that network and a relatively modest amount of storage. And the reason for that is it's a widespread system. When the sun is shining in Queensland, it doesn't matter if it's raining down in South Australia, as long as we can move the power from one place to another. Okay. The wind's blowing strong in one place, it's probably not somewhere else. Big weather systems move through, they're typically about 1,000 kilometres inside. Okay. So if we have a system which is much bigger than that, then we wash out the variability in the weather, and the system is much more stable, much more reliable, and much lower cost. To give a sense of that, we did our modelling, turning off that interconnection between Queensland, between Brisbane and far north Queensland. Okay, if we took that out of the system, it costs about $2 a megawatt hour more for the NEM than if we didn't have it. You go $2, it's not really very much, is it? 240 terawatts, that's $400 million a year, positive cash as a result of putting in that interconnection, because we've exposed ourselves to much bigger weather systems and much better sharing. What do you think we might be able to do if we start connecting this in? When's the sun shining in the Pilbara? When's the sun not shining in the East Coast? It's a huge potential resource of taking solar energy to match the evening peaks in the East Coast. Then in the morning it can get sent back the other direction. But the topic of the talk was exports. Okay? So we can put all that electricity within the system. The easy thing we can do is what the report that went in this morning, Pilbara Solar and the Minister was talking about, we could export the electrons to Indonesia, put a big HVDC and we'll sell the electricity overseas. But what I'm going to talk about is some other potential opportunities. What we're going to start to need to do next is look at the other industries after electricity where we need to reduce emissions. So if you're in the Pilbara, what do you export lots of? You export iron ore. Okay? We export it overseas, we export the coal overseas, and we convert the iron ore to iron by reducing it with carbon. And we emit CO2. That's the process that we go through. Okay? We don't do it in Australia, but we do it overseas. So if you look at the total amount of those emissions, what we're looking at is double Australia's current total emissions. Australia can do more for global emissions by fixing this than we can by doing anything else within Australia. Okay. So what do we do with our carbon instead? Okay. And we've already had mention of this. We need to find something else that does the same job as carbon. It doesn't do it as well. It's going to be more expensive, but we do have an alternative. And that alternative is hydrogen. Okay. We take water, we pass an electric current through it, and it splits into hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, and we can then use that hydrogen as a tool to do other useful stuff. So we've taken our renewable energy and we've converted it into something else which has renewable value. Okay, so if we do that, instead we're taking our iron ore, we're processing it with hydrogen, and we're producing iron. So what we're going to export is iron instead. Okay? The waste product is water. Okay? Can go back into our earlier loop. This is huge. If we took all of the iron ore in the Pilbara and turned it into iron, we would need 4 times the electricity that Australia currently produces. Okay? That solar advantage that the Pilbara has of the potential for being the lowest cost energy around the world from solar, this is where we can deliver it. That industry shouldn't be happening in China, shouldn't be happening elsewhere in the world. Australia should be turning it into iron here in WA. Okay. Once you've got that, okay, you've suddenly got hydrogen as an enabler for all sorts of other things. Okay. So there are people who are talking just shipping it overseas. So Japan is looking at hydrogen for transport. So we could compress it and try and ship it overseas, but it's tough. Okay? Hydrogen being really, really light element, it's really hard to compress, really hard to liquefy. Okay? It's quite a challenge, and there's a lot of energy involved in moving it overseas. But there are other ways that we can do it. Okay? So we've already got an ammonia industry up in the Pilbara. Okay? The reason that there's an ammonia industry is that reaction, nitrogen plus hydrogen, produces ammonia. We can use it for fertiliser, but we can also use it potentially as a medium for shipping the hydrogen from one place to another. Okay? The reason it's in the Pilbara at the moment is that the way we develop the hydrogen now is we take methane and we crack it with water and we produce CO2 and hydrogen. Okay, so the methane, that natural gas that we have up in the Pilbara at the moment, we're using to make hydrogen, but for some other purpose. Okay? So we've already got the idea there. It's now just a matter of when do we start to look at that transition. Okay? Again, we're not going to do it because it makes economic sense today. Okay? The reason that we use coal today, the reason that we use natural gas for these processes is that they're cheaper. No question. This is not something that is going to be cheaper. But as the world starts to recognise, and it increasingly is, that we need to reduce carbon emissions, there will be a price on carbon, okay? And enabling ourselves to be able to deliver energy without the production of hydrogen, or deliver products without the production of carbon dioxide. I want to produce hydrogen. Without the production of carbon dioxide is going to be a really important part of our future export mix. Okay, we talked about using methane as a transport fuel. Okay, so Woodside talked about liquefied natural gas as being the transport fuel of the future for heavy vehicles. Okay. Light vehicles, relatively easy to electrify. Okay. I can put a battery in a car and I can go a few hundred kilometres, even 500 kilometres if I get a Tesla S now. Okay. We're going to electrify transport, that's going to be fine. Planes and trucks and ships are much harder. Okay. So again, once we've got hydrogen, we can start to look at synthetic fuels. Okay. So we just reverse a reaction that we did before. Instead of burning methane to produce carbon dioxide, okay, what we can do instead is we can take the carbon dioxide, combine it with hydrogen, okay, and we can reproduce methane. Okay. What's the Pilbara already got a bucket load of? Natural gas trains. Okay. So there's another opportunity there to transition from we're digging this stuff out of the ground to we're using that renewable electricity to generate our product that we can then ship to the world. Okay. After that, planes don't really work well on natural gas. Okay, we need something much bigger, a much longer molecule, but we can do that too. We can make things like kerosenes and similar ones by other reactions, where again we take carbon dioxide, whether it be from the ocean or whether it directly from the air, and convert that through to a synthetic fossil fuel. Okay, it does exactly the same job, lets us fly our planes around the world, but we're taking that renewable electricity, taking it to hydrogen, and then allowing that energy to be used for something that we want to do. Okay, so that's my vision. And that's what we're talking about, and what we're really interested in exploring is not what's going to happen tomorrow, not what's going to happen in the next while, but the future is there for the Pilbara to really be the leader in terms of exporting renewable products around the world, whether that be hydrogen or iron or ammonia or synthetic fuels. There's a whole range of products, and the list goes on. Okay? And this is where I get into trouble. This is where I show up that I'm an East Coast person, not a West Coast person. Because this is the sun rising on a new solar industry in the Pilbara. Thanks very much.